forgotten historically, chief among them the Second Seminole War, with over 1,500 soldiers dying and $20 million spent by the American government, is the most expensive Indian war to date. Upon the conclusion of the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson, acting largely independently, marched into then West Florida and wrestled it away from the Spanish. Soon after, East Florida fell into his hands. With a fading empire and no money to support it, both halves of the Floridas are sold to the United States, and soon after, settlers start heading further south. In 1823, it became necessary to protect both settlers and natives. The Treaty of Moultrie Creek set up a reserve for Seminoles and a southern boundary for Americans through north-central Florida. With hindsight, the actions of Indian Agent Colonel Gadsden can be seen as duplicitous and coercive. Nonetheless, the quest for a continental empire continued. The people elected Andrew Jackson president in 1828, and in 1830 he signed the Indian Removal Act, forcibly removing the Seminoles and other various native tribes to western land in modern-day Oklahoma. It was around this time that Fort King was built. Named after Colonel William King, commander of the 4th U.S. Infantry, it was more a trading post than it was a fort. In 1832, Gadsden again was sent to negotiate a treaty, this one the Treaty of Paynes Landing. And not mixing his words, Gadsden was adamant that Seminole conditions would continue to worsen if they didn't move west. Again, the Seminole leaders were coerced into signing the Treaty of Fort Gibson, vouching for the conditions of the Oklahoma Territory. In April 1835, at this outpost fort in Ocala, Florida, the Treaty of Fort Gibson was read out loud to the assembled Seminole tribe by General Duncan Lamont Clinch and Agent Wiley Thompson. Among those Seminoles in attendance was a young man named Billy Powell. He rose amongst the crowd, came up to the desk where the treaty was being read, and said, "This is how I sign," and boldly slammed his knife into the table. Thus, the legend of Osceola, also known as Black Drink Shouter, was born. As hostilities increased, the importance of Fort King grew. It became central to all the forts in the territory, like the hub of a wheel with all the military roads branching outward from it. As it became more prominent, the U.S. Army made it the seat of their southern command. By 1835, those forces were led by General Duncan Lamont Clinch, the commanding officer in Florida, having attained the rank of brigadier in 1829. Born in North Carolina, he rose through the ranks of the U.S. Army during the War of 1812. His actions, however, would be swift but incomplete, leading to a cavalcade of field commanders. Seeing the need to force the Seminoles from Florida, troops were dispatched to Fort Brooke in Tampa. Company F of the 2nd U.S. Artillery was stationed at Fort King, with various other companies of the 2nd being dispersed along the border. In December, Major Francis Dade and the 4th U.S. Infantry were given orders to march north along the Fort King Road to strengthen the garrison at that fort. It was here on this road on December 28, 1835, that Major Dade led the 4th U.S. Infantry, Company C of the 2nd Artillery, and Company B of the 3rd Artillery to their destination of Fort King. It is reported that he told his men that once they arrived, they would receive 3 days of rest. He withdrew his pickets and threw caution to the wind. Soon after, he was ambushed. Of the 105 soldiers, 3 would survive the day, only 1 would survive their wounds to go on and tell the story of the Dade Massacre. Dade, who should have known better, thought such an attack in daylight was ludicrous. The first volley raised by the Seminoles killed Major Dade and Captain Frazier. Several other officers were either killed or mortally wounded. When a lull in the fighting presented itself, the men who remained alive managed to build a small, triangular breastwork knee-high. The fierce fighting lasted roughly 5 hours, ending at 2 in the afternoon. Unknown to Dade's contingent of soldiers were the events unfolding at Fort King. On December 28, 1835, Agent Wiley Thompson and his aide, Lieutenant Constantine Smith, exited these doors with the hopes of going for a leisurely stroll. They were met by a hail of arrows and bullets. The Second Seminole War had officially started. It is said that Wiley Thompson was killed by the same Spanish rifle that was gifted to Osceola in a sign of friendship. Hearing of the surprise attack on Major Dade's column and the death of Wiley Thompson, Territorial Governor Richard Call asked for volunteers to join him in fighting the Seminoles. On December 31st, only 3 days after Dade's massacre, Governor Call and roughly 500 volunteer militiamen joined up with General Clinch and 250 Army regulars to fight a disastrous defeat known as the Battle of the Withlacoochee. What soon followed would be the defining story of the Second Seminole War. General Edmund P. Gaines, commander of the Western Territory headquartered in New Orleans, brought 1,100 regulars and volunteers up to Fort King Road, burying the bodies of Dade and his men before continuing on. After another disastrous defeat along the Withlacoochee, in which Gaines had to be rescued by Clinch, Winfield Scott assumed command of the forces in Florida. Scott, too, found little success. Leading an army to the Seminole hideout called the Cove, he discovered it abandoned and retreated to Fort Brooke. In September 1836, Governor Call again led a volunteer force against the Seminoles at the Battle of Wahoo Swamp. This, too, was unsuccessful, and Call was forced to retreat. Around this time, the decision was made to abandon Fort King, and it was soon burnt to the ground by the Seminoles. The replica fort that now stands in its place is one that was built in 1837 under the command of Major General Thomas Jessup. By December 1836, Major General Thomas Jessup assumed command. He had varying success throughout Florida, but was unable to force the Seminoles into a decisive battle and capture Osceola. By mid-1838, tired of fighting, Jessup asked to be relieved. The following 4 years saw Colonel Zachary Taylor, Major General Alexander Macomb, and Brigadier General Walker K. Armistead all tried to end the now 6-year conflict. By 1840, the fighting in Florida was reduced to minor skirmishes. In the last action at Fort King, 3 men of the 7th U.S. Infantry, captained by Gabriel Rains, were killed. In 1842, Colonel William J. Worth declared the war over. No treaty ending the war was formally signed, but by the following year, the final soldiers left Fort King, which soon became the county seat of Marion County. Fort King served as the courthouse of Ocala until 1846, and by 1920 had been completely torn down.